Not very long ago, I had a meeting with a young couple who are about to get married. And they're school teachers, and they were telling me about how their high school in March, probably on March break, I didn't ask now that I think about it, is going to lead a trip to Europe. And one of their stops along the way is going to be London. And so I really like London, and we started to talk about things you can do when you're in London. And they said, well, they've got a very strict itinerary and, going to be going to see a very specific set of sites, but we do have a couple of hours one day to kill. And I suggested to them, you really should go to the British Library. The British Library, to me, is the hidden gem of all of the tourist attractions in London. It's a large library that has an archives and things that you access privately, but one section of it is a little museum to the history of printed documents. And there is an incredible range of wonderful artifacts that you can see. For instance, you can see ancient manuscripts of the Bible and little scraps of papyrus that the New Testament was copied on hundreds and hundreds of years ago. You can see political documents, treaties that have been signed by important leaders. You can see musical manuscripts, very sheets of paper scribbled on by Mozart or Beethoven or even the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. It's a wonderful place to go and visit, and it doesn't cost anything. And I suggested to the couple, if you have time, I really recommend that you go there. Many of the decisions we make are based upon the recommendations of others. We learn things by word of mouth. We look to the testimonials of our friends and families to see what are good things to do. Maybe if you're like me and you're considering a big-ticket purchase, you might read a magazine like Consumer Reports to see what others are saying about the different products that are available. You can find a testimonial about anything these days. You can look up on the internet and find what students have thought of a certain professor or what patients have thought about a certain physician. Recommendations and testimonials are important parts of our daily lives. Today's scripture, which Joyce read so well for us, includes a very famous and well-known testimony or recommendation about Jesus. Philip said to Nathanael, "Come and see." Our episode comes very near the beginning of the narrative of John's Gospel. Jesus went to John the Baptist to be baptized in the Jordan River. In that baptism, it was revealed to John that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah, or anointed or chosen one of Israel. John said it out loud when it was revealed to him. One of John's followers, whose name was Andrew, heard John say this about Jesus. Andrew went after Jesus and had a conversation with him. Andrew concluded that, yes, this Jesus is the one whom our people have long waited for. Andrew went and told his brother Simon. Simon was brought to Jesus. He too became convinced this Jesus is the Messiah. And Jesus said, "From now on you will be called Peter," which means rock. And then John tells us, Jesus went to their hometown of Bethsaida, and there he found Philip. There are all kinds of other things from the context of the story which reveal something to us about this first meeting of Jesus and Philip. For one thing, we know that Philip decided to become a follower of Jesus. But we don't know what conversation or interaction lay behind that. It's very interesting because John's gospel tends to favor long, drawn-out, detailed, even repetitive stories. Here, Jesus found Philip. Philip decided to become a follower, and we wonder what kind of conversation might lie behind that. But what might Philip have learned or heard in that time which convinced him to become a follower, to change the course of his life in a very significant way? And it leads us to the question, how much do you have to know about someone before you make a change in your life based on that knowledge? Now, if you have a little girl anywhere in your life, a friend or a family member, you probably know about the Disney Frozen movie. We certainly know about Frozen in our house. By osmosis, I have memorized most of the songs. Frozen is about these two young princesses. The older princess has a magical power to create snow and ice out of nothing, and it's a power she can't control. And after their parents die, the castle becomes locked down so that the world will not find out about this magical power she has but cannot control. When she comes of age to become the queen, the castle gates are opened for one day. Her younger sister is desperate to have some interaction with others. And she meets on that one day a handsome young prince who's come to visit for the coronation. And she is so desperate to get out of the locked, hidden castle that in just a space of a few hours, she decides to get married to this handsome young prince. And she goes and introduces the prince to her sister, who has just become the queen, and she says, "This is Prince Hans. We're going to get married, and we would like your permission." And her older sister, the queen, says, "No, you don't have my permission. You can't marry a man you've just met." It's an interesting question. How well do you have to know someone before you make a decision about a relationship with that person? How much do you have to know about Jesus before you decide to become one of his followers? Philip decided to follow Jesus, and he went and found Nathanael. And he said to Nathanael, "We have found the one written about and pointed to by Moses and the prophets. He is Jesus from Nazareth." It's interesting, I think, that Philip says, "We have found." It's a clue, perhaps, to some of the undescribed goings-on that lay behind his decision to become a follower of Jesus. Who is the we? Perhaps it was Andrew and Simon Peter from the same hometown. Maybe he had had some conversation with them, and it reassured him of his decision to become a follower. When Nathanael heard the news, his response was an amusing one. Can anything good come from Nazareth? It's interesting how there's been a little rivalry revealed between the Galilean towns of Bethsaida and Nazareth. Some of you may remember the TV show Cheers. I used to love watching Cheers, and one of the main characters was Woody Boyd. He was a young, naive farm boy from Hanover, Indiana, who had gone to Boston and began working as a bartender in Cheers, the bar. And a running joke in the series was how Woody was always telling jokes about these doofuses from neighboring French Lick, Indiana. In one episode, Boston Celtics star Kevin McHale visited the bar. And all the people in the bar were thrilled to meet this legendary player, and they said, "What's it like to play with Larry Bird, who was a great player for the Celtics and who was from French Lick, Indiana?" And Kevin McHale answered, "Larry is a great guy, and he has a wonderful sense of humor. He's always telling jokes about these doofuses from Hanover, Indiana." And we can see this little rivalry between Bethsaida and Nazareth playing out, and we can imagine some of the jokes that they maybe told about each other. "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" asked Nathanael. And Philip answered, "Come and see. Come and see for yourself." No preaching, no argument, no demonstration, but an invitation to Nathanael to come and see Jesus for himself. Very often, someone from this church, one of you, will come and offer to lend me a book. And on the recommendation of that person, I am interested to read the book. Now, sometimes it takes me a long time to get to it, and if you've lent me a book, I'm sorry I haven't returned it yet. But I'm interested to read it because you enjoyed it or you found it helpful. Just before Christmas, someone from this church bought me a little book about Jesus, and because it wasn't very long, I set out to read it. And I had never heard of the book before, but I enjoyed it very much, and I learned something new about Jesus. In fact, I liked it so much, I went and bought a copy for my dad. Just a few years ago, the American football player Tim Tebow, who had a rather short professional career, wrote a memoir. Now, lots of celebrities write memoirs, but what was unique perhaps about Tebow's was how prominently he spoke of his Christian faith in the book. Tebow's parents were missionaries. He was homeschooled, the whole 9 yards, a very traditional, conservative Christian upbringing. And the book was very popular. It sold lots and lots of copies. It became a bestseller. And many people were surprised by this, especially given the religious content of the book. I remember listening on the radio discussion, and people were wondering, why has this book sold so many copies? And one analyst said, it's those Christians. They don't just buy one copy of the book, they buy 20 copies and give one to all their friends. Well, I didn't think that was such a bad evaluation. People saying, come and see. An invitation to learn more about faith in Jesus. Well, Nathanael accepted Philip's invitation, and Philip led him to Jesus. And as Nathanael was approaching, Jesus said, here is someone who is a true Israelite, in whom there is no deception. Nathanael's response was again amusing. How do you know me? I've always thought of myself as a true Israelite in whom there is no deception. And yet, Jesus, you have noticed this. Jesus said, well, I saw you earlier when you were sitting under the fig tree. And on that scant evidence, Nathanael confesses Jesus. He says, "You are the King of Israel and the Son of God." And Jesus said, "You think that's something? I will show you greater things than this. In fact, you will see heaven opened. You'll see angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." This is a fascinating allusion, this angels ascending and descending, to a well-known story from the book of Genesis about Jacob. If you grew up in the church and went to Sunday school, you might remember the story of Jacob's ladder. Jacob was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. He set out on a journey, and he came to a place where he had to stop for the night, and he laid down, and he was going to have to sleep outside. He was in the wilderness, and he lay down with his head on a rock, and he had a dream. And he saw something, traditionally a ladder, but maybe something else, that reached from earth to heaven. And he saw the angels ascending and descending. And he heard God's voice speak to him a word of good news and reassurance. And then when Jacob woke up from his dream, he said to himself, "God is in this place. This is the meeting of heaven and earth." And I think John, the gospel writer, wants us to see that in Jesus we find the meeting place of heaven and earth. In him we hear the voice of God. It leads to the question, where for us is that meeting place of heaven and earth? I experience that meeting place only very occasionally. And I experience it when somehow in faith I discern that God has communicated with me in some way, shape, or form. It's never an audible voice or anything like that. Quite often, God will speak to me through the words of someone else, and there's just something about it where I realize that it was God speaking through that person. For instance, I remember I first felt a call to study theology and go into the ministry in my parents' living room. In that moment, I experienced that as the meeting place of heaven and earth. Years later, when I was studying theology, I wasn't quite sure exactly what sort of ministry I ought to do, what sort of job or work ought I to engage in. And I remember I felt called to do this kind of ministry, to become a preacher, when I was reading a book while sitting on Wrightsville Beach in Wilmington, North Carolina. I've since given away a number of copies of that book. It's out of print now, but I promise you I probably would not leave a copy on the shelf of a secondhand bookstore. There's an American author named Martha Grace Reese. She's recently written a series of books under the heading Unbinding the Gospel. The books ask readers to achieve a rather modest goal. It is to set aside some time with friends from church to talk about their faith. For instance, when you're at coffee hour, don't just talk about work or the weather or the big game. Say something to your church friend in the safety of your church building about your faith in Jesus. And then maybe, just maybe, argues Reese, you might inadvertently mention your faith to a friend or a family member. And not that you're going to convert them or indoctrinate them or have to convince them to become a Christian, but just to say, I have a faith. And if they seem interested, you could say, well, come and see. Now, all of you, I'm sure, will know who Oprah Winfrey is. I don't particularly care for Oprah's shtick, but apparently she's quite popular. Every year, Oprah comes out with a list of her favorite things. They're products that she chooses to endorse. Now, when Oprah endorses a product, it becomes a huge commercial boon. They call it in business the O factor. In 2005, one of Oprah's favorite things was Garrett's Popcorn Shop in Chicago. On the afternoon when Oprah released her list for the year, the Garrett's Popcorn website had 100,000 hits or visitors. In the month that followed, sales of the popcorn doubled. It is so interesting that we live in a culture where people will turn to popcorn on the recommendation of Oprah. We have found the one pointed to by Moses and the prophets. He is Jesus from Nazareth. He is the Messiah of Israel and the Son of God. Why don't you come and see him? Amen.